What is shame? Why do we feel it? Where do we see it? For many of us, shame acts like a moral compass. It can push us to reflect, to grow, or sometimes to shrink away and really just do nothing at all. But what if shame isn't just personal to you? What if it's being placed strategically onto certain people, bodies, and communities? In this video, I want to explore how shame has been used as a tool of control through colonialism. More specifically, I'll look at how colonial technologies, things like science and body, debt and schooling, have shaped not only societies, but how people feel about themselves. And yes, I know, you might be wondering what I mean by technologies of colonialism, or even just colonialism itself. But don't worry, we're going to unpack that together. Let's begin. The ideas and references in this video are deeply rooted in the works of Chris Manjapra, James W. Dashuk, and Sean Coulthard. During my undergrad course in colonialism and post-colonialism, I was assigned readings from all three authors, and throughout my winter term I would steadily apply their ideas to my final project. This video is my final project. It aims to highlight how shame is not only an emotional consequence of colonialism, but also a deliberate tactic to maintain hierarchies and power. So what is colonialism? Right away we can define what it's not. It's not just a historical event, and it's certainly not a relic of the past. When people hear the word colonialism, they might picture invasions, conquests, and wars, but it's also so much more than that. Historically, colonialism has been deeply tied to the transatlantic slave trade, which involved the kidnapping and forced displacement of millions of indigenous people. Some were transported across oceans, while others were enslaved on the very lands their ancestors had lived on for generations, like indigenous communities in South and Central America, or the people of the Congo in Africa. Dr. Chris Manjapra offers us a powerful description of what colonialism does. It sought to unmake entire civilizations and replace them with its own logic. That logic? It was one of extraction, domination, and dehumanization. Colonialism commodified the body and pushed it to its absolute limits in order to generate enormous wealth and power for empires. But colonialism isn't just defined by what it did in the past. It has an identity. It's a system of power that reshapes societies, regions, and identities. It's a long-term structure that embeds itself into laws, economies, and cultural norms, feeding off dependency and hierarchy. Because without dependency, there's no control, and without control, there's no empire. And so, how did colonialism maintain that control? Through what we call colonial technologies. These aren't gadgets or inventions, but systems and tools, such as science and body, debt and schooling. They were designed to discipline, devalue, and dominate colonized bodies. Colonial technologies are the methods used to control not just land and labor, but minds, bodies, and emotions. And that's where shame comes in. Shame is complicated. There is no concrete way to prove that every one person feels shame the same way, but we can attempt to define it generally so that you, the viewer, understands what I mean when I use the concept of shame. For this contextual purpose, I'll be quoting philosopher Martha Nussbaum for what she defines as shame, and be using her definition as the definition for shame in this video. She states, "Shame works by making us view ourselves through the eyes of others, and in doing so, it can either encourage ethical reflection or become a source of deep social subjugation." Science under colonial rule was not a pursuit of knowledge, but a technology of domination, a tool used to justify racial hierarchies, control populations, and shape the colonial body into a site of dehumanization. Science and the body were deeply intertwined, not just in terms of medical experiments, but in the very foundation of colonialism's ideology. Science was employed to dictate who was worthy of personhood and who was a mere object of study, labor, or subjugation. Eugenics was a so-called science used to justify racial hierarchies by controlling who could reproduce. It claimed that traits like intelligence or morality were inherited, leading to policies that encouraged desirable populations to grow while restricting or eliminating undesirable groups. In colonial states, this meant forced sterilizations and policies designed to limit indigenous and racialized populations, while promoting white settlement. Coulthard argues that these policies were not just about controlling bodies, but about maintaining colonial power structures by reducing indigenous presence and erasing cultural continuity. In Canada, Indigenous women were forcibly sterilized under the Sexual Sterilization Acts of Alberta and British Columbia, a policy aimed at erasing Indigenous presence through biological control. This aligns with what Dashuk describes as a broader colonial strategy of population management, where the state actively controlled Indigenous health and reproduction through starvation, malnutrition, and medical neglect. These same ideas shaped Nazi Germany's Nuremberg laws, which classified people based on racial purity and restricted marriage and reproduction between Jews and non-Jews. The Nazis didn't invent these policies. They studied eugenics programs from North America and Europe, refining them into a system that justified genocide. Anjapra highlights how colonial science laid the groundwork for these racial ideologies, demonstrating that fascist and colonial regimes operated through shared strategies of population control and elimination. Amal Treacher expands on this by analyzing how shame is inscribed onto colonized bodies, forcing them into a constant state of justification for their existence. Shame here is not incidental, but an enforced emotional state, a technology used to instill inferiority in the colonized psyche. For example, Indigenous children in Canada's residential schools were measured, categorized, and experimented upon under the guise of civilizing them. Their bodies became the subjects of nutrition experiments where they were deliberately malnourished to test Western dietary theories. This was not simply a misuse of science, it was science fulfilling its colonial function to control, extract, and dehumanize. In the Caribbean, the biological justification of labor marked enslaved Africans as fit for work, based on pseudoscientific theories that claimed black bodies were more resistant to heat, disease, and pain. The result was a lasting, racialized economic structure where black labor was perceived as endless, unfeeling, and disposable, a myth that lingers today in wage disparities and labor exploitation across the world. If science dictated the colonized body's worth, debt ensured its continued control. Because debt isn't just an economic burden, it's a form of social and psychological domination. As Glenn Coulthard argues, colonialism doesn't just seize land and resources, it reshapes how indigenous communities perceive themselves, creating a dependency that fosters internalized shame. In Canada, Indigenous economic marginalization wasn't accidental, it was engineered. James Dashuk documents how starvation policies were deliberately used to weaken Indigenous nations and force them into economic reliance on the state. Treaties promised land and resources, but in reality, Indigenous people were pushed onto reserves with little means of self-sufficiency. Their survival depended on government rations, which were frequently withheld or deliberately inadequate, reinforcing a narrative of indigenous economic failure. Over generations, this dependency turned into internalized shame, with indigenous people being told that their struggles stemmed from their own shortcomings rather than deliberate colonial policies. As Coulthard puts it, colonialism's most devastating impact may be its ability to transform the colonized own self-perception to make them see their poverty and dependency as natural rather than imposed. This pattern isn't unique to Canada. After the Haitian Revolution, France demanded reparations for lost slave labor, plunging Haiti into a cycle of debt that stunted its economic growth and reinforced the global narrative of Black self-governance as a failure. Coulthard argues that these forms of economic control aren't just about wealth extraction, they shape identity. Generations later, the descendants of the enslaved and colonized are still blamed for the poverty imposed on them, reinforcing shame and self-doubt. This continues today through policies by the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and World Bank. Their structural adjustment programs push heavily indebted countries, especially in Africa and Latin America, to cut public services and focus on attracting foreign investors, repeating colonial patterns of control and dependency. As Vincent de Goléjac shows in his study of working-class families in France, debt is more than a number. It becomes a mark of moral failure. While his work focuses on France, the emotional patterns he describes resonate in many post-colonial societies, where poverty and financial struggle are framed as individual weaknesses rather than consequences of systemic exploitation. As Goléjac writes, debt becomes a moral fault, and poverty a shame to be hidden. And so, to summarize this colonial technology, debt doesn't just create financial hardship, it rewires self-perception. It convinces the colonized that their poverty is their own fault, making it harder to break free from both economic and psychological oppression. Schooling is the final and most insidious colonial technology I will be covering in this video. Schooling operates at the level of habit formation and identity construction. Schools do not just teach subjects, they teach compliance, hierarchy, and, for the colonized, a profound sense of unworthiness. As Glenn Coulthard argues in Red Skin, White Mask, colonial schooling systems in Canada were not simply about education, but about producing a compliant Indigenous subject. By forcing Indigenous children into residential schools, the state sought to disconnect them from their communities, their histories, and their political traditions. Coulthard explains that these schools were part of a broader structure of colonial recognition that only values Indigenous identity when it conforms to the norms of the settler state. James Dashuk's Clearing the Plains also shows how this educational violence was inseparable from broader policies of dispossession and health neglect. Malnutrition, disease, and displacement were all part of a system designed to weaken Indigenous communities, and residential schools extended that violence by breaking the intergenerational transmission of knowledge, health practices, and collective strength. Dashuk writes that by the 1880s, many children in residential schools were suffering from tuberculosis and other preventable diseases, exacerbated by overcrowded and unsanitary conditions that mirrored the broader neglect of Indigenous health across the prairies. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission corroborates this, stating that residential schools were never about care but control. They were a systematic government policy designed to assimilate Indigenous children into Euro-Canadian culture while weakening family and community bonds. Children were routinely punished for speaking their languages, expressing spiritual beliefs, or practicing cultural traditions. Shame became institutionalized. As Manjapra notes, colonial schooling in multiple contexts, Canada, the Caribbean, India, served as a key tool of empire. It created a hierarchy of knowledge where colonized students were trained to admire Europe and distrust their own histories. This psychological colonization ensured that even after formal independence, many formerly colonized societies continue to reproduce colonial values. As Treacher explains, when shame becomes part of one's identity, it leads to self-surveillance, a constant internal policing of behavior and aspiration. And so, through the reproduction of shame in school, shame then plays the role of colonizer in the psyche, managing behaviors and ideals that best suit the status quo. Learning about the ways colonialism manipulates the use of science, body, debt, and school can tell us a lot about how colonialism spreads shame. Shame is meant to be internalized because colonizers have been telling oppressed and marginalized peoples that their shortcomings, losses, and social status is their fault alone. Colonialism and its benefactors ignore the grief, the structure, the racism, and the supremacy. They don't want to see, and they are okay with twisting and forgetting the truth. Hence the perpetual gaslighting. Because all their money, their power would not be theirs without the blood, sweat, tears, and the grief of the colonized, the refugees, the immigrants, the people. Colonizers and their systems seek dominance at the expense of regular, hardworking people, people of color, of different social backgrounds, indigenous and disabled, queer and two-spirited. Their ways of oppression, ignorance, neglect, and exclusion are something to be ashamed of. There is no pride found within their hate, their violence, and greed, and there can be no community or functional society truly founded on these principles. This inequality invades every corner and institution of a colonial society. It targets Central and South American immigrants and migrant workers, refugees. It targets indigenous mothers who were denied the dignity to say no to sterilization. It targets newborns birthed into a system that has been built on the backs of their ancestors, while the same system itches to extract all the nutrients from their umbilical cords. Colonialism, and its facade of a civilized Western society, incites violence and dependency, conquers bodies through science, impoverishes countries and people, and uproots land and traditions. But still, despite being aware of all this information, standing tall and proud, colonialism still plants its flag firmly into the ground, into foreign soil. However, what they don't know is that there is pride in love and community, reparations and gratitude. There is still pride in you. But your shame, the shame given to you, the shame that says you are not good enough, you are not welcome, you can't do it, is not your shame. It's theirs. So I hope you can see that you are not just another body, a number, or a student. You are a human that deserves dignity, respect, and a place within this world.